Hey guys, welcome back to Stop the Shunning. My name is Bethany. If you are new to the channel, I'm very excited today to be speaking with Jackie Johnson. She is a former Jehovah's Witness and licensed clinical social worker specializing in trauma, abuse, and cult recovery. She is also the Executive Director of ICSA, the International Cultic Studies Association. I had the pleasure of speaking with Jackie recently about her experience and just wanted to have her on the channel so she could share her insights and the wealth of information that she's accumulated over the years. So we'll go ahead and get started. Jackie, you there?
Yes, I am here, Bethany. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks. Thank you for inviting me on your channel. I'm really excited to
Thank
be
you for being
spending this time with you.
Thank you for being on. Much appreciated. We'll go ahead and get started. Can you give us a little bit about your background growing up as a Jehovah's Witness?
Sure. My parents became Jehovah's Witnesses when I was 10. We were Catholic before that. I come from a large Italian family on both my mom's side and my dad's side. And when I was about 10, I'm the oldest of four kids. When I was about 10, my parents started studying with Jehovah's Witnesses, and it was a quick transition. They started studying in the beginning of the year in January. By September, they were baptized, and the end of that year, there was no Halloween, there was no Thanksgiving, there was no Christmas, and so life just moved along really quickly in Jehovah's Witness lifestyle.
Wow. Okay. And so, as you were growing up, did you have any doubts? Were you harboring any secret doubts? Were you really into it? What was the vibe that you were carrying around, or what did you get from this?
I never, as a kid, um, kind of like mentally converted. I think there's a couple reasons for that. I was old enough when my parents started studying that the belief system of Jehovah's Witnesses just didn't take for me. There was a lot that didn't make sense. I think I was old enough to have remembered, not Catholicism naturally, because we weren't big practicers of Catholicism. But like I was saying before, we had two huge families on both my mother's side and father's side, and we were really close to them. So I had a lot of that experience growing up. When we became witnesses, my dad kind of cut us off from both sides of the family. So by the time they were baptized and witnesses, I was old enough to kind of understand and have a lot of conflict about the changes in our life. And the belief system of Jehovah's Witnesses never really made sense to me. And I saw, um, a lot of discrepancies in terms of, the integrity of people and the integrity of belief systems. Not to say that I didn't have good relationships in the different congregations we were in, because I did. I think a lot of rank and file JWs are good people, and I think that they're sincere. But I had really bad experiences with the elder body most of growing up. So between having bad experiences with the elder bodies and with not really agreeing with the belief system to begin with, and the trauma of being removed from our relatives, it was a really conflictual childhood.
That's a lot to digest. Yes. And I like how you mentioned that a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses, they are good people, and you were able to have some good connections and good relationships, but the whole thing was just didn't make sense to you. Can you be more specific about what didn't make sense or just what you weren't able to process? It just didn't sit well with you?
Yeah, I mean, there were kind of like the requirements of JW life. There was not being allowed to have a normal childhood in terms of having friends in school and not being able to participate in curricular or extracurricular activities at school. So, and it's not just that it was embarrassing or awkward, it was unnatural and it was unhealthy, to have to go to school, from what was it, fourth grade to, senior in high school. I lived in a big development where there was a lot of kids, and I had a lot of friends before we became witnesses. And then all of a sudden, as a child, You're expected to kind of back away from those friendships, keep everyone at arm's length, trying to navigate in school. Kids naturally make friends. You're trying to make friends with kids, yet at the same time stay far enough away so that they don't invite you places, and that so they don't expect you to invite them. So you learn to, as a kid, you have to learn to kind of create these semi attachments. And so that was a big, problem. It was really unhealthy. There was also, the requirements of JW life, of going door to door, um, and having all of those expectations of turning in time slip reports and going out in service door to door, and your behavior at the meetings, and boundaries being breached, because a lot of times the elders and people in the congregation think that they can, kind of say whatever they want to you or parent you. And so it was just a lot of these very unnatural and unnormal um, just things in life that didn't make sense, and that I knew enough from our pre-JW life were really contrived, and not real. Um, so it was stuff like that, really. It was just like there was no sense of belonging. It's kind of hard to put into words, actually. I think unless you've been
Right.
a witness, you kind of know what the lifestyle is like.
No, I actually think you nailed it. Um, I remember I was born into the organization myself, and I had outside people. I had family who were not witnesses, and so I had that reference point. But I do remember, and I went to public school, kindergarten through 12th grade. Like I think a lot of people think when they think of Jehovah's Witnesses, first of all, they don't know that it's a cult. It is a cult hiding in plain sight.
Mhm.
And, and also, and I know you know this, a lot of times when people hear the word cult, they think of like some really strange character and it's like some small group in somebody's backyard. You grew up in on a compound or underground or something. And it's like, I went to public school K through 12. I even went to college. That's a different story, but because I know a lot of witnesses are not allowed to, or they're discouraged from going to college. But I did have this reference point. It's not like I was completely, like you said, you had these friendships and there's these weird boundaries that you're doing this dance. It's very awkward for a child, very unnatural. I had family that weren't Jehovah's Witnesses. I grew up in public school. I was exposed to all that, but like you said, I always had to keep people at arm's length. You don't really ever feel, I'll speak for myself, I didn't ever really feel like I was part of humanity. I just walked around with this otherness. I never,
Yes. Yeah.
never felt like I was just human like everyone else. So, no, I think you absolutely nailed it. It was very articulate.
And that, yeah, exactly. And that, for me, the way that the witnesses kind of reinforce that or address that proactively is, and you'll probably remember this, is, that whole philosophy of your alien residence. And so as you're growing, I know, as you're growing up
All right.
and like you don't belong anywhere. Like you don't belong with your non-witness relatives anymore, and you stop even seeing them for decades. You don't belong with your peers, or kids in your neighborhood or kids in your school. And their answer for that, which is drilled in as part of the indoctrination, is, well, you're alien residents in a foreign land, and they make that Bible reference. And it's really hard growing up to have no sense of belonging and no real support system of your own. I mean, like, our support system was really just my parents' friends in the congregation, but they were adults, and half the time
Right.
they didn't have kids. And if they did have kids, we were kind of forced to be friends with those kids, but they weren't our friends. And so it was just,
Right.
um, and it wasn't really confusing, because, like I said, I was old enough by the time we became witnesses to know that it was you know, just a very contrived situation,
Right.
and not, I mean, I knew it was wrong. I knew this was not the way that normal life was supposed to be. I had experienced normal life. And so it wasn't that I was confused, um, or even angry about it. It was me always saying, someday I don't know how, but someday I'm going to have a normal life again, and it took a long time to get there though.
Right, right. It's a very arbitrary, especially in your case, because you had some reference point as a child, very arbitrary, canned, manufactured new life that was imposed on you. What was so you mentioned congregation, relationships weren't super confused necessarily or angry, but like one day I'm going to get out of this. You mentioned earlier how you had issues with the elder body. Can you talk more about that or like what the turning point was where you finally said enough? Like I'm getting older and can you explain the events kind of leading up to when you left?
Well, my enough point came much later in life. There was a lot of cognitive dissonance and fear around leaving. So, I mean, just to fast forward to that, I didn't end up disassociating myself until I was 52 years old. So the point, those 42 years between the time that my parents brought us into, the cult religion until I finally left at 52 were a lot of ups and downs, and it was never really a confusion situation. It was really just like, how am I going to get out, because there's so much obligation and there was really nowhere to turn, just so isolated, for decades. And the guilt, all of the emotional bondage, right? Um, and a lot of the cognitive dissonance, not necessarily about the belief system, but in my case, what got in the way was the cognitive dissonance around the victim blaming. So, it's my fault if I leave. I'm going to devastate my family. How am I gonna? It sounds like to the milestone of autonomy when you're a Jehovah's Witness is so missed that exercising your autonomy seems like a huge lift that you just can't even approach. And so the autonomy of saying, I just want to live my own life and I don't believe in this and I want to leave, it like is not on your radar. It's something that takes a long time for some people, myself included, obviously, to be able to get the strength and the even the wherewithal to know how to approach gaining your own autonomy back to make a basic decision about the way you want to live your life. So
Right.
to kind of back up about, what led to that was, well, I think your first question was about the problems with the elders. As I was getting into, teenage years and, you know, I guess fairly attractive, female teenager. We had the area that we lived in was very close to a lot of the Watchtower complexes. It was close to the Wallkill complex. It was close to what now is in Warwick, the headquarters. It was close to Patterson. It was only maybe an hour and change away from the New York City complexes. So I say that to say this, that in our local congregations, we had a lot of the young witness, quote, Bethelites, you'll know that word, um, who were assigned to our congregations always. And they were young, they were 19, 20, and I was here getting into 15, 16, the age of natural attraction, right? And so what ended up happening with me in almost every congregation that we were in, as we moved around locally, we didn't move. Our family was always in the same house, but you know how the elders like just shuffle people around in new congregations. And so there would inevitably, be a young man, who was far from home and young and immature and hormones are raging, who would express interest in me. And I was always the one to blame. I mean, so I was always called in by the elders and questioned and, accused. And yeah, I would say in my head, like, these guys are dorks. Like, I hate this religion. Why would I even want to pursue this guy? Like, it's not me. But, the other sad thing about that is, the reality that, parents, including mine, could abdicate some of their parenting to these elders to allow grown men who are leaders in, whatever congregation to have private conversations, basically, grilling, a young girl about some young man's interest. And I mean, how inappropriate, but it does speak to how indoctrinated the parents are to allow that to happen. So there was a lot of that in my teenage years, and even into my 20s, but I got married young to a witness, who didn't want to be a witness, so that was a good thing. And we had two kids. That marriage didn't last, unfortunately, because it's really hard, I think, for witness young people to stay married when they don't want to be witnesses. You just have no sense of identity and you don't really know how to get along with people because everything is always so scripted and contrived. And so the marriage didn't last. We had two kids. He didn't remain a witness and neither did I. So thankfully our kids are not witnesses today and neither is my granddaughter. But what after that divorce, there were other, many years of back and forth conflict as well. And just to back up, before my first husband and I were married, we were both disfellowshipped. And so, that kind of put another layer of disgust about the situation, being shunned at a young age and having to, my dad was like, you have to move out. You can't live at home anymore until you come back and get reinstated. And both of us got reinstated when we decided we wanted to get married, because the families kind of pressured us into doing that. But, I ended up getting disfellowshipped again years later when that marriage fell apart. So there was another episode of shunning. So from the time I was 19 until I finally left when I was 52, most of my adult years were in a shunning state. So, I say that to say that my relationships with my siblings and my parents broke a long time ago. It wasn't just when I decided to disassociate myself at 52. Those relationships broke at in the teenage years. And then all the years of shunning kind of really, just kind of decimated those relationships on certain levels. So, it was a lot of the pressure to get reinstated, the back and forth, and it was hard. The good thing that came out of one of the times I was disfellowshipped is that's when I went to school. People will say, as you said, how did you go to college? Witnesses are not allowed to go. And when my first husband and I got divorced, I was a single mom with two little kids, and just had a high school diploma, no skills, no nothing. I was like, okay, what am I going to do with this situation? Um, and I decided to go to school, because there was nobody to stop me. I was in a disfellowship state and I went to my local community college and registered, and that was the end of that. I just kept going until I got my, actually my doctorate degree. And so, you know, that was great. That it was great to be able to finally live a life, you know, that kind of put me on normal ground, where I could, have a normal career, and make money and not be in poverty and be a better example to my kids. But, after that, I got reinstated again. And so,
And around we
yeah, I
go.
mean, it's like
Yeah.
people think it's crazy, but until you can really understand a lot of the indoctrination that happens on an emotional level,
Oh
you
yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and for me, that was it. It wasn't really, um, it wasn't really going back to the organization because I knew it was the right thing or I was sorry for whatever I did, it was just that emotional bondage, um, so I was reinstated for a couple of years, but by then I was in my late 40s. And um, then I started, what got me to my enough point, I know it's a long story, but was this, that I, out of curiosity, watched the Scientology documentary Going Clear. Just out
Oh,
of curiosity. I was bored
very
one day
good
and I'm like,
film.
oh, yeah, like, let me just watch something,
Very,
I'm like,
very good film. Yeah.
it was the best thing because I just watched out of curiosity because I never knew anything about Scientology, and Tom Cruise had been around, and so um, as I'm watching this, I'm saying, oh God, like we are the same thing. It's like, and I always say it's like it's still ice cream, just different flavor. It's like it's the same
Yes.
thing. We just call it something different. We just label it something different. And I was like stunned for a couple of weeks, and then I started slowly, because it was very scary, as you could imagine, going on the internet and doing some research about the witnesses. And it was petrifying, I mean, again, it's like that indoctrination of like your soul is now doomed because you are, reading things.
Right.
Um, but I discovered a lot. The thing that got me to my enough point was discovering the cover up of the child sex abuse.
Mm.
Number one, because it's so disturbing and disgusting. Number two, because it was so hypocritical. But by then I was a licensed social worker in practice, and I thought, I can't stay in this organization ethically. I just can't stay. And that's what gave me the courage to leave, actually, was not approaching disassociation from a personal level. It was like, this is the price I have to pay, but ethically, I can't stay as a social worker. And it made my decision to leave, you know, executable, I guess. Yeah. So that was my enough point, and that was how I got there.
It's never, you know,
It's
Jackie,
never easy.
it's never easy. Thank you so much for being very detailed, because when former Jehovah's Witnesses talk, I know like people I've been interviewed before and they say, well, like, what's your waking up point? It's never really one thing. It's multiple. There's this whole journey. It's never just this perfect linear journey. There's like things that crop up when you're 10 years old, and then when you're 15, you're thinking of this, and then you go through this event that brings up new feelings and new thoughts, and it's all kind of cobbled together, and there's multiple things that are kind of, at least I'll speak for myself, but like brewing, you know,
Yeah.
that are brewing, and it's not adding up. Your intuition says something's off, but I have to agree with you. That was the thing that led to my disassociation as well, was when I found out about the child sexual abuse cases. And I thought to myself, like you said, this is wildly hypocritical. When I was growing, I was born in the 80s, and it was like in the 90s and early 2000s, it was like, oh, the Catholic, they've been railing against the Catholic Church.
Yeah. Yeah. I know.
Railing against the Catholics for their mishandling of child sexual abuse. And I'm thinking, you hypocrites, you have
Yeah.
your own, you have your own issues, this massive problem, and you're pedestalizing yourself as the truth in this clean organization, and you're not taking accountability, you're not listening to victims, all these things. Same thing, ditto. That was finally the thing.
Yeah.
It's never really just one thing. I always had issues with it. It didn't really take root in the truth never took really root in my brain. But like you said, that emotional bondage, yeah, that was definitely the thing that I agree. It just so happens that that was the thing that led me to disassociate as well. I said, I can't align myself with this organization anymore. Um,
Yeah.
based,
I ended up knowing, after I discovered the whole issue, and I started talking about it more, and talking about it in our family, no one wanted to hear it, of course, but I ended up discovering that someone in our own family had been molested by a ministerial servant, and members in the family knew. And then someone in my second husband's family, she also grew up as a witness. My second husband was not a witness, but it was a relative of his, was also molested by someone when she was a child, and nothing was done. And so it brought it home. But then from a professional standpoint, it was like I had this different type of experience and knowledge about the damage that is done from child sex abuse. And I had, at the time, my career was working in New York State juvenile justice. So I was working directly with many young boys. I managed boys facility in the state of New York who had in their history was this trauma of child sex abuse. And you can just see the trajectory of, what that abuse does to someone's development, their sexual development, their emotional development, their mental, every kind of way. And so I had this professional experience of not just the disgust of child sex abuse for what it is, but of knowing and the experience of working with people who had suffered from that type of assault. And the disgust turned to heartbreak and then anger over, and then there's, videos on some of the YouTubers about, the witnesses in back rooms talking about how they're going to destroy records and the blue envelopes. And oh, I mean, and when you start learning how to get access to all of that, like back room information, that your regular rank and file don't know about, it's just infuriating. And I went to my witness family about it. I'm not a shy person, and so
Right.
we had many, arguments. I mean, I certainly did not handle my family the way that is recommended to handle, but we had many arguments. I just could not contain myself,
You're so upset. How could you just yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to
Well,
interrupt.
my father has been an elder since I was, a young teenager, and my brother is an elder, and one of my cousins was and I just could not um
Jeez.
talk to them in a civil manner,
Right.
knowing that they knew, and so confronting them about it and um it was just a bad time, it was a bad time, but it got me to where I am today, and it kind of gives me a different perspective on shunning as well, which is probably not a popular perspective, but it works for me personally. That, um, shunning, of course, is horrible and it's against people's human rights. In my life, the shunning is a protection, because people who would be interfering in my life and who are still peddle toxic philosophies and pressure, they keep themselves away. And so the burden of setting boundaries and still being faced with the chronic, witness mentality in conversations doesn't exist. And I don't even have to do anything about it. I can just kind of live my
Right.
life and it stays in its rightful place on its own, and so,
Right.
it's been a hurtful gift, but it's a gift in reality. I mean, I know that, my witness family's not going to change. And so I'm not into fantasy thinking about, what it would be like to be with my family again at dinners and this, that, and the other thing. I know what it would be like, and it's not, it wouldn't be the fantasy, it
Right.
would be the reality.
Thank you so much for sharing that, the shunning perspective, because I've talked about this on my channel and just in general conversation with current and former Jehovah's Witnesses, is that like you said, it's not right. It's not right that you're doing this to another person. Like you should be able to coexist, demonstrate some sort of tolerance. And the shunning thing is not good. There's psychological damage. It's not right, like you said. It's inhumane the way that Jehovah's Witnesses practice it. And at the same time, I've had some well-meaning friends say to me, and I know that they're coming from a good place. And it's not so much, sometimes it's an acquaintance, but it has been one or two friends that I can think of. Like, is this like a reverse shunning of your family? Because my parents are very devout. I have a sibling who's still in, and and I say that there is a difference between shunning someone over ideological differences and not reaching out, me not reaching out because I refuse to facilitate my own abuse. I'll see like on Reddit or on different social media platforms, people will get into these texting wars with their family. You'll see a big block of text where they're just trying to wake their family up, or they get sucked into this drama cycle, and I feel bad for them and I have compassion, but I say, like, you're literally just, I'm sorry this is happening to you. The shunning thing is not right. Nake nake, they should be using their brains and not be indoctrinated. But, if there's not going to be some sort of mutual respect and tolerance, if they're clearly just going to shun you and not accept you for who you are, do you
Right.
want to keep going to that and peeling back the wound and putting salt into it? No, the shunning thing on principle isn't right, but at some point you have to take the reins of your life and move forward and draw boundaries to protect yourself. It's a protective, like you said, a protective mechanism. The shunning is like a blessing in disguise in that way.
Yeah.
So I really
I mean,
appreciate you bringing that up.
yeah, for sure. I mean, and people, it
Sorry.
creates such, no, it's okay. The shunning creates such a automatic emotional response sometimes that it doesn't allow people to stop and think about this is that what do you really want for your post-witness life? Like, what role are you going to take in your own life? So what I mean by that is, do you just want to move forward with your freedom peacefully and rebuild your life? That was me, right? And so it's like, and that's most people, I believe. But what I mean by that is, are you now going to adopt an activist role? Are you going to become an activist where you're constantly fighting and trying to prove your point and trying to change things and get involved? That's okay if you want to be an activist, even if you want to be an activist within your own family system. I mean, you don't have to be a YouTuber or this or that. You can be an activist. And so what I'm talking about is what role do you want to have in your own life and with your witness family who remains? Do you want to be an activist who continues to fight and try to prove your point and get them to change and move? Do you want to be an advocate who, was always kind of promoting, your own kind of rights within the family system, even though you're not being heard? Or do you want to just be like, say goodbye and walk away and have a peaceful
Right.
life? If someone does want to be an activist in their own family and get into all these texting wars and never stop fighting and, never stop trying to change their family's mind, that's fine. But you have to understand and say, is that what I want for my post witness life? And
Right.
if it is what you want, then have at it, but I would have clients who would naturally fall into that activist mentality and activist role with their remaining JW family and be depressed and angry and not be able to heal and not be able to move forward. And my advice to them would be kind of what I just said. It's like, okay, wait a minute, like set that aside. Like that's a role you're taking on. You don't have to take on that role. If you want to, fine. But you might just need a break. You might need to stop watching the YouTube videos.
Right. 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 Right.
Might, like
Right.
you might as well have just stayed in because you're still immersing yourself with all of it and clearly you're not handling it well.
Right.
So for me it was like I did for a while. I had that natural reaction of being an activist in my family and trying to prove things, sending documentation, sending videos, arguing, and finally I'm like, what the hell am I doing? Like
Right.
my life is more chaotic now than when I was in, and they're not going to change. And what do I care? And I finally realized one day, a lot of people disagree with this too, is like, hey, I want autonomy to live my life my way, but I
Yeah.
have to give them the same autonomy. And if they want to stay in the cult, if they don't think there's anything wrong with it, they have the same human rights that anyone else does. They don't have the right to harm others, and cults are harmful. But I can't take on the role of trying to change them, you know.
You can't.
So it helped me get to a peaceful point.
Good. Good. No, I appreciate your perspective on that. Um, I've talked to you about this. You and I had this conversation that there's a difference or there's a line between compassion and coddling. And I feel like it's one thing, like when I do YouTube, my YouTube videos and everything, I want people to know I have look, I came from the same thing. I was there. You are not going crazy. Don't let the organization gaslight you. And like you said in the beginning, when you were waking up, it's terrifying just to even like read that comment someone left, you know,
Yeah.
on the internet. And then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, I shouldn't be looking at this, but she's right or he's right. And then you click and then it's the rabbit hole. And then you find out
Mhm.
whole community. That community was very helpful to me in 2018 when I disassociated New Year's Eve 2017, so rang in 2018 free. And for me, the YouTube community and the whole activism community, that the XJW community, I should say, was extremely helpful. It was an extremely helpful pit stop, is like
Yes.
describe it. Because you need to know it's not, I mean, like you can, how do I say this? I've come across this, and it's usually it happens to be guys that say this. They'll be like, "Oh, Watchtower is full of shit and blah blah blah," and in 1914 it was 607. Da, 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 da. But guess what? They're like sitting with their Bible at the Kingdom Hall next to mom and dad, and behind the Bible is Crisis of Conscience. So they pat themselves on the back for dismantling um all the doctrine, but emotionally, like you've been talking about this whole time, emotionally, there's this strong, they got you just trapped. It's
Yeah.
kind of
Yes.
emotional blackmail or emotional bondage, as you worded it. So when you leave or you're fading or wherever you're at in your trajectory, you find the YouTube, at least I'll speak for myself. When I found the YouTube community, it was like, I always knew the organization was off. My intuition, my gut always said something was off. I can't like I don't really care about the doctrine. I don't really believe in it anyway, but emotionally, I love my parents. And what does this mean?
Yes.
The implications of all of it. So falling down that rabbit hole and getting into the YouTube community and seeing all the comments and the videos and Lloyd Evans, I'm going to give him a shout out. He was in
Oh, I was just about to do that. Yeah.
whatever he's a polarizing figure and I don't care. He was instrumental
Yes.
in
Same.
he was
Yeah, same.
instrumental in helping me because he was very measured. He was calm. He wasn't the angry apostate that we had this image of, like, the apostates are just angry and out to get us and they have their digital pitchforks. He was very calm. He broke things down. And so that just, whoa, opened my eyes. And so it was very validating. And I say that validating, and it was very helpful, but it wasn't like I don't I don't need you to tell me I'm wonderful and a shining star, and I don't need to hold your hand and be we don't need to sit around and braid each other's hair forever. This is this is just helpful for me. I'm so grateful for this community, and so much so that I started my own channel.
Yeah.
People came to me and said, "Hey, this has been helpful." So I have no regrets. But so I love it for a compassionate pit stop. And if you just want to be like a subscriber who just happens to like a video
Hmm.
and you come back around, you kind of stay within that sphere on the periphery, that's cool. But I will come across people. I came across people then, and come across people now who stay immersed in it so deeply that they're just this ball of anger, and
Yeah.
that they have not worked through their stuff. And I'm not a therapist, and I'm not like, oh, I went to therapy, so I'm perfect and I'm fixed. But like at a certain point, you have compassion, but you also have to be proactive and take some kind of practical steps. Even if you still like the YouTube community, you still find community, you have to take some sort of steps to create positive change in your life. So what other good things are you adding in? Is it therapy? Is it gardening, surfing? Is it like, what
Yeah.
good things are you bringing into your life? Like you said, when you were disfellowshipped, you went to school. And so you were putting yourself on a positive path to do something good with your life. I really appreciate that. So I think there's this balance, and that's kind of what I wanted to not only get your thoughts on, but also like what events led up to you becoming a therapist, and who were you working with in therapy? Did you work with a lot of, former or current Jehovah's Witnesses? What were any challenges that came up with that?
Well, I have to say I agree 100% with what you experienced with the XJW community coming out. And it was the same for me. And by the way, like you and I are basically the same age, not chronologically, but I also came out in the turn of 2018. I actually
Right.
wrote my letter to headquarters in April of 2018, and that's when I broke the news to my family. So
Ah.
um, so happy 7 years to us. But um,
Woo!
I also, you know, I maybe it's because of my age. I'm not a huge social media person, and YouTube was kind of new, and I didn't even really know how to use it. But a friend of mine told me about Lloyd Evans, and so I looked him up. And Lloyd was instrumental for my quote recovery. Um, because yes, his demeanor with the videos, but he was sharing information about things I needed to know about the organization. It wasn't like an emotional validation, like you said, and like I wasn't looking for any of that. Like I didn't need the empathy, I didn't need the, emotional validation. I wasn't upset. I was on this quest to find information and facts.
Right.
And because I needed to know what to do. And so I just was not wallowing. I was searching for information. And so Lloyd was instrumental in all of his videos were educational and informative and gave me the information that I needed to make, a decision. So that was kind of that. And I didn't really stay connected. I didn't immerse myself in the XJW community at all. It was, I wanted a real life with local friends. I didn't want to belong to like a cyber community of people. And there's nothing wrong with it. I think people just need to know what's most helpful for them moving forward. If people need that level of validation, or if people need that type of validation, and they need, a community, that's fine. It's maybe what certain people need, and some people need other things. I know that I was working too. I didn't have time to go down a lot of social media rabbit holes. I was working, juggling jobs, to raising kids, and um, so I didn't have time to really make that my new community. But it gave me the information that I needed. Um, so the compassion, I think people need to understand that compassion is not the same as codependence, and empathy is not the same as codependence. And as witnesses, we learn nothing but codependence, especially as children, because it's always the children. Your behavior is a reflection on your parents, your reflections of behavior on Jehovah God. You don't want to make, the parents are never really there to support you. You, as the child, are always there to validate the
Mm-hmm.
congregation, to validate the elders, to validate your parents. And so we learn nothing but codependence growing up as JW kids. And that can be confused easily with compassion and empathy. So there's a lesson there for people to, some homework for people to do, but um,
Did you work with a lot of former Jehovah's Witnesses or current Jehovah's Witnesses?
um, hard to say because my private practice started slowly. I mean, I
Okay.
was a licensed social worker in 2005, and that's when I started my career in the state of New York in the juvenile justice system. And then I got my doctorate in 2016, and that's when I started my private practice. Um, and it was, slow. I mean, like any practice, when you started, it's slow, so I had, and it's almost 10 years, so I kind of forget, but I've had a mix of regular mental health patients. My private practice started really with just mental health patients because at that time in 2016, I was still a witness. I was a reinstated witness. So I didn't disassociate till 2018. And in 2018, and after I, did more and more investigating about the witnesses, that's when I started kind of branching out, to taking, you know, former cult members or JWs or whatever. So that specialty in my private therapy practice came later. Um, but once it took off, I had a mix. I actually had a lot of Nexium clients because of the area in New York where I lived.
Great.
So Nexium was out of Albany, New York, which is about an hour north of where I was living. So I had a lot of almost 10 Nexium clients over the years.
I,
Um,
I just interject really quick.
yeah,
Sorry, in case anybody's not familiar with Nexium, they could watch, I think on HBO, it's called, or Prime, it's called Seduced. And then there's also
the vow. Yeah,
Val. Yeah,
yeah.
I just want to throw that out there in case anybody wanted information on. Nexium.
Yeah. And that was, that was a little bit hard because, some former Nexia members, lived, in proximity to me. So we would meet in person and you get to know people on a different level when you're doing in-person therapy rather than, just virtual. And it was really hard to hear what some of them had gone through. But, so I had a number of Nexium clients. I had a mix, I had a couple of Scientology clients, a number of LDS, some from like the real connotation that people have about cult, like backwoods, tiny, small, obscure groups that have no name, and I
Right.
don't even know how they found me, And then of course I had my share of JWs, and yes, I think that the JW clients I had did feel more comfortable. I think they felt safer because as a former JW, I knew what was at risk with them. I also,
Yeah.
they didn't have to explain anything
Right.
about, they didn't have to explain anything.
Right.
So that's a
Thank
huge
you.
thing. Yeah.
Exactly. If I could just say really quick, thank you for mentioning that they didn't have to, they like you just got it. Because when I started going to therapy during my fade, and I was probably, it was a couple of years that I was in therapy with off and on with different therapists. And I had, it was kind of trial and error because just for different reasons. I wasn't looking for a JW specific therapist. I don't even think there was one in the area. But I was just trying to find the right therapist for me. It was just trial and error. So the one lady that I went to, she was very kind. She listened. She was very just like buttoned up and sat there just, But she was kind of like a deer in the headlights,
Yeah.
would listen to me, but had not even rudimentary knowledge, didn't even know that the witnesses are a cult or that they're a very controlling religion. Um,
Hmm.
so she listened and I appreciated that, but then I would kind of like it was during my fade, I hadn't officially disassociated yet, and I was looking for constructive feedback. And so here I am in tears, and I'm not saying I want you to tell me everything I want to hear and feel all warm and fuzzy, but just I need help shore me up. Like what can I do to be more assertive? How can I? She didn't have any. I was going through that emotional stuff. It wasn't about like paradise and 607 BCE. It had nothing to do with doctrine. I didn't need help dismantling Watchtower. It was, how am I going to stand up to my family? How am I going to come out and say, this is just not me? It was all this emotional, just this emotional baggage. And so
Yeah.
she was very, very compassionate again. But I didn't need her to just like pet me and say everything's going to be all right. Like, just what should I do? Wasn't offering me any constructive feedback. So I ended my, our therapeutic relationship. Very kind lady. But then I finally found somebody who did, who was the things that I was looking for. And she was not a JW expert, was not a former Jehovah's Witness. She was acquainted with them. She was from New York. So she was acquainted with them, but she gave me she was the right therapist for me. And so when I talk about therapy, um, I haven't really talked about it much on the channel. I guess I'm talking about it now, but I spent a number of sessions with her, and it wasn't like at the end, like, okay, I'm fixed, everything's great. Obviously not. But she equipped me with the tools to be proactive and to help myself and to not be susceptible or get sucked into the emotional manipulation of like, oh, I'm just sending this person sending me an encouraging text. No, 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 no. Or this person sent me this, or
Right.
mom
Right.
saying this, or dad saying this. Like, she really helped me to become really my own person. I mean, I had to do the work, but she set it up and she had a really good balance of constructive feedback and compassion. And that was helpful to me. So, and even then, it's not like, oh, well, after an arbitrary number of sessions, you're fixed. I think people, just people in general, but especially like the Jehovah's Witnesses I speak to, you'll get people in different camps. And I know you've come across this. I'm sure you have. Some people like, oh, therapy, oh, no, no, therapy. Okay, then don't go to therapy. But what are you doing if therapy's not right for you, what proactive positive steps are you taking? And it just so happens that I have good things in my life. I had good things in my life. That's good for me personally, just having at least a stretch of time where I was in therapy. It helped to have an objective perspective because sometimes if you talk to a friend, they want to fix it or they don't quite get it or they're going to agree with you because they're your friend and they love you. Or you can't just dump everything on your spouse or a family member. So having a therapist who is trained and professional and offers a listening ear but also offers that constructive feedback, I think could be helpful. It was helpful for me, but I didn't need to like be glued to her hip for 12 years. You
Yeah, yeah.
she just kind of helped give me that boost of putting me on the right path. And I'm still, working on stuff. You're never really a finished product, but
Yeah, for sure.
that bottom line is just it was beneficial for me to go to therapy. And again, I say this jokingly, but not joking, oh, I went to therapy, so I'm perfect. It's not that. It was in my journey of things that have helped me, stay hydrated, get some
Yeah,
exercise
yeah.
and vitamin D and fresh air. What am I putting into my body? Does it make me sick? There's all these factors, that add to the big picture. And just on my journey, therapy was one of those things that helped me. The YouTube community helped me, therapy helped me, certain people that had nothing to do with therapy helped me, so I just appreciate, your perspective and any insights you may have or advice you may have for people who might be considering therapy, but they're not quite sure, they think it's bogus or something like that.
Well, cult recovery therapy is unique, of course. It's not really unique, but there's elements of cult recovery therapy that need to happen, and so one thing I'll say about, it's hard to find a therapist who comes from your specific cult background. That's always going to be difficult. And it's hard to find a therapist who even has cults, kind of experience at all. It's not an elective in school. It's not something that colleges teach, in mental health programs. And so, um, I say that just to say that, people are not necessarily going to find a cult recovery therapy, but they can look for a therapist who knows how to do other elements of what cult recovery needs. So, the way I approach cult recovery therapy is to kind of follow a loose, kind of loose linear process of first starting off with psychoeducation. What is a cult? What does that all mean? Talking about the cultic phenomena. And also, then getting into, okay, now we've learned a little bit about cults. How does your group kind of measure up? Let's analyze your group compared to what we've learned. So, and that psychoeducation part is really important because it helps the therapist and it helps the client get on the same page about what they're really talking about. And it helps outline what the person experienced in the group. And that helps set goals for the rest of the work. So when that's done, I typically move into trauma recovery because inevitably, being in a cult means that you've sustained, even if you haven't sustained actual trauma, because I don't like overusing that. I mean, in today's, kind of TikTok world, I think like trauma is overused and it's like not everything is a trauma. You could have been harmed, you could have been damaged, whatever, but not everything is a trauma. We don't need to be, like a total victim, with everything. But anyway, we do trauma recovery work, which is like processing the things that happened to you and not just what happened and how you felt about it, but how those events shaped you and kind of altered your um, identity, your worldview, everything. Like, and that's where a lot of the work is spent. When that's not really going to be done. We're always evolving, as people. But, then I typically move from trauma recovery into identity work. And to me, that's the most important part of cult recovery because therapist now is dealing with someone who either never had an identity of their own because they were born in, or had their identity hijacked either at a young age or even as an adult, usurping their identity and taking on a new identity from the cult. So, your therapist is helping this person prepare to step out into the new world to be the person they want to be. You have to create your own value system. You have to talk about preferences, learn how to make decisions, learn about boundaries, all the things that being in a cult takes away from you, and not having an identity of your own. You're building that and creating that and helping the person build that. And it's important to do that identity work after the psychoeducation and after the trauma recovery, because you don't want to build your new identity without knowing about cult manipulation. And you don't want to build your, you know, after cult identity while you still have unresolved trauma, because it's going to affect your perspective on things. So I say all that to say that if someone can't find a cult recovery specialist, they can find a therapist who can do those elements of therapy, or they can find someone that they connect with and talk about, this is what I want to accomplish in my work with you, doctor, therapist, or whoever you are. I want to talk about this. I want to do trauma work and I want to do identity work. And if a schooled and licensed clinician can't handle those types of approaches, then they didn't go to school. So, it's like people should be able to make it work. You don't have to find someone who was in your cult or even knows too much about cults. Like, the client can help guide the process, and that's totally fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I wanted to, and again, this is one of those buzzwords, Jackie, healing. I,
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure it's, I'm
I
sure,
don't like it. Yeah. I'm not crazy about the healing thing too. And there's all these buzzwords that, that communities and social media people and even professionals use. And the other thing is, are we safe? So, what I say to a lot of my clients when they use a lot of these buzzwords is, let's really talk about the meaning behind that word. Like, what do you really say? What are we really saying? Let's operationalize the word healing. Let's operationalize the word safe. Let's operationalize, all of these kind of trauma, and so we really know what we're talking about here. Healing is a hard one because it can give a really skewed, you know, kind of understanding of what we're talking about. Being a human means that you're always evolving, and we have a memory, we have scars, we have all these things, and those things continue to evolve. I mean, even physical scars, we think a scar is healed, but it's still red. And then a year later, it's not as red, like things continue to evolve. Life is about human development, and so how are we going to attend to our human development without staying in therapy for 25 years? I mean, it's like, and there's a question, and I say this to people too, what you need to do some thinking about: why are you in therapy for 25 years? Just a random number. And why is your therapist keeping you in therapy for 25 years? It's to me, my approach is like, that's not really the goal. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But it was so enjoyable. I mean, my practice is on hold now because of being the executive director of ICSA. It was just, it was not fair to my clients to have to juggle, like that. But I really enjoyed private practice with particularly XJWs, because it's different for me. The way I approached it was very, very different from just having a mental health client. There's certain decorum, as a therapist, and there's boundaries and all of that. But with cult recovery clients that I had, and being, an ex-cult member, especially with, XJW clients, it was more of a relationship, in terms of, we're healing together. I'm going to learn as much from you as you're going to learn from me. And we're going through this together. And, a lot of times either I or they would joke like, hey, we were brothers and sisters in the congregation, and it's like, I don't know, like you kind of know each other, even though you don't know each other. And so it really was a very, very different type of therapeutic relationship, which was even supportive for me, as a therapist. I mean, of course, I'm still the therapist or still the client, but it was supportive and it was nurturing because you both know that each other went through the same experience and you both understand each other. And you can kind of just like let your hair down and just be yourself with each other. So it was, and even with my, former cult clients who were not witnesses, it was the same thing. I'd say to them, look, ice cream, different flavor. I get it, and I'm still, kind of evolving from my cult experience too. We're in it together and we're going to learn together and we're going to support each other. And it was like really great work. It was unique.
To be a former Jehovah's Witness, and like you said, any former cult member, but to be a former Jehovah's Witness and to have a therapist who is a former Jehovah's Witness. I mean, I had a great therapist who was not a former Jehovah's Witness. So to have one that was, I mean, you absolutely.
It was helpful. I mean, because a lot of another way that it was different is, in traditional therapy, you really don't disclose things about yourself. And, there's all that, and that was always hard for me, by the way, because I'm a very open person, and so it was really hard. And so it was kind of a relief, approaching cult, recovery work differently. Because to be honest, like when my clients would know that I was disfellowshipped a couple of times and then even went back and got reinstated and I would tell them a lot of my experiences because they needed to hear it. They put things in perspective for them and then having conversations about, do I get disfellowshipped or do I fade or do I, just like Pimo or, do I just, or do I disassociate myself? Like people don't know how to approach leaving, and so it was helpful for me and for them that I had those experiences of making the decision to disassociate and how and why I came to that decision. And is that the best decision for them in terms of the way that they need to leave? What was it like being disfellowshipped and sharing that experience sometimes with people, the experience of getting reinstated. Um, all of that was so helpful to the process for people. So that's another way that this work is really, I don't know if other, cult recovery therapists who are ex-cult members do this too, but for me, letting go of a lot of those traditional boundaries between client and therapist was really helpful, in my practice. Um, so it was just enjoyable. It was really enjoyable.
Right. I guess that's what I mean in a way by healing, even if it's loosely, very loosely applied.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
about just connecting with somebody who knows, who's been there. And
Oh, yeah.
Jehovah's Witnesses that said, Bethany, I went to therapy and it was like they basically described they had to kind of like walk their therapist through like, oh, so what does this mean? Disfellowship, what's that? Oh, it's huh? So you mean they don't, this happened to me too. They really won't talk to you at all? This seems a bit extreme. Yeah. So trying to like train your therapist, it's enlightening for them because they don't know anything about the witnesses, having to
Yeah.
I went through this where they had to kind of like walk, like they're in pain and they're struggling and they're like trying to walk their therapist through JW world. And the therapist is sitting there with their clipboard just going, huh, and it's not helpful. So having somebody like you, or at least somebody, with a rudimentary knowledge of the witnesses is extremely helpful. Um, because yeah, cult recovery, that's a whole other bag.
Yeah, I mean, and that process is more than just annoying, having to explain to your therapist, what you went through. It can be re-traumatizing. You're reliving without processing things that happened to you. So you're reinforcing in your brain that experience by recounting it without processing it. It also is financially, it's prolonging the process. So, you're paying for more sessions that you shouldn't have had to pay for. And it can be really emotionally harmful sometimes if you have a therapist who can't keep their composure and they respond like, oh my God, really? Or eyes bugged out. I mean, therapists should never do that anyway, but it's like, if you are dealing with maybe a young therapist or someone who doesn't have composure like that, and they think that that type of reaction is validating, but it's not, it can be really harmful for a client, for therapists to respond that way. And so, that could be a problem too
I
with that.
had a therapist at one point. This was not the one that I ended up staying with, but one therapist, and I'm not attributing bad motives or like she meant to hurt me or anything like that. But I said something to her and it was something embarrassing and I was ashamed about it. And I told her, and she goes, "Oh, and really? You're," and I told her what happened. I told her the situation and I didn't want to have to talk about it, but I had to talk about it. And the
Mm.
And really that, like your mom or dad didn't do dot dot dash. Huh.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, yeah, it is, lady. That's why I'm in therapy. Like, I
Yeah.
didn't want to have to go through that. I didn't want to have to live through that. I wish that my parents had done better in this area. They were great in a lot of areas, but in these few areas, they were not. That's why I'm in therapy talking about it, and your reaction of like, well, the rest of the known world would have done blah blah blah. And it's,
Yes.
she didn't do it on purpose to make me feel bad, but it was just like, all right, great. All the shame and like embarrassment is happening again. I kind of just needed her to have a poker face.
Yeah. I mean, another issue too that a lot of therapists don't realize is that this is like developmental trauma. So, a therapist may say, well, you're an adult, you have autonomy, and but they don't understand that from a human development perspective, those developmental milestones were not met.
Yeah.
So their expectations of their clients are based on normal human development over the lifespan, but those developmental milestones were not met, which disables that client from, taking those steps of, that autonomy would allow them to have, or they don't have an identity developed, or they may be extremely indecisive, and
It was almost
and
like,
the other last thing too is like we're so isolated, in the cult. You
yes,
don't want your therapeutic relationship to mimic that isolation in terms of the therapist making you feel odd or weird or can't relate, and it just further drives the point home that you're still isolated because you can't even connect with the therapist. So there's so many things to consider.
yes, that you nailed it. It was is almost like, well, at 25, a normal 25-year-old would have
Yeah, yeah.
dot dot dash. And I'm like, I'm not a normal 25-year-old lady. I wasn't 25. I think I was 31 or 32 at the time. I think I was 31 at the time, but there was certain things and I'm like, yeah, my life has not been normal. So, but like you said, she was reacting in a way as if, well, other 31-year-olds would have already dealt with this or had family member, had helped them deal with this or whatever. And it's just like, yeah, I don't have that luxury. So that is why I'm here. So anyways, you nailed that. Well, wrapping up here, Jackie, you've shared so much. What advice, last piece of advice would you leave for anyone watching this? They're really struggling and they might be considering therapy. What advice would you have for them?
I think I would go back to what I was saying earlier in the interview about really thinking about what you want your post-cult life to be. If you because you really have to start with envisioning what you want your life to be like. Do you want to keep the fight going? Are you going to be an activist, in your own life? And I don't mean an activist in the outside world where you're trying to affect change, on a global level. I mean like an activist in your family where you're like fighting with your family and trying to, you know, um, is that what you want for your life? Do you want to, just kind of try to stay connected to your family? So you're going to try to stay physically in, even though you're mentally out? Do you need like a total start over with peace and quiet, and freedom? Like, what do you want to get to? And that, because you have to be able to envision that. You have to be able to work toward it. You can't just let yourself, like drifting in an open sea, kind of end up somewhere based on where your emotions might take you. Um, y- Leaving a cult means you have to really take charge of your life. And a lot of people have never had to do that, especially people who were born and raised in. They've never had the experience of being in control of their own life. So to me, really, and it might change, your goals for your post-cult life might change, but you have to start somewhere and say, I'm going to take control of my life. This is what I want my post-cult life to be. I'm going to, you know, and then work toward that. So at least you have an approach, and at least you have, kind of like a road to go down. Um, and it can always change, but it's going to be hard work, because the cult always did everything for us. And now we have to, kind of own this process, and it's okay to not know, but just like start somewhere.
Excellent advice. Thank you, Jackie, so much for sharing your story, for being on the channel today. Really enjoyed your insights. As a former Jehovah's Witness and a therapist, I guarantee you have helped many people along their path and will continue to help people as they listen to this interview. Really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you for being on the channel. If you enjoyed this interview, please like and subscribe for more information about Jehovah's Witnesses. And if you'd like some more information about ICSA, the International Cultic Studies Association, I will put a link in the bio. And I will see you next time. Thank you again, Jackie. Have a good one.
Thank you so much, Bethany, for having me here. I enjoyed it.
Enjoyed it too. Thanks. Bye.
Take care.